Ready for a deep dive into some seriously strict laws?
Oh, absolutely. I think this will be fascinating.
We're talking 10 countries today where, like, even small slip-ups can have some major consequences.
Oh, okay.
And we're using this article from 10mosttoday.com. It's called 10 Most Known Countries with the Strictest Laws.
Okay.
But we're not just going to, like, list off the laws.
Right.
We're going to really get into, like, why they exist, what it's actually like for people living under them.
I think that's what's so interesting about this. We often just take our freedoms for granted.
Yeah, totally.
And this kind of gives you that perspective, like a fresh perspective on how these laws really shape societies.
Yeah.
Impact people's lives every day.
Exactly. Not about judging. It's more about understanding.
Right.
And speaking of understanding, let's kick things off with a country that might surprise you.
Okay.
Singapore.
Uh-huh.
So you think modern, bustling city-state.
Right.
But did you know that, like, chewing gum?
Spitting, jaywalking, like that can get you a hefty fine.
It's true. Singapore has that reputation. Very strict.
Yeah.
But it's also known for being incredibly clean.
Yeah.
Super efficient.
Yeah.
Low crime rates. And it really highlights how they've prioritized order
Right.
and social control, even if it means limiting, certain personal freedoms.
So like a trade-off then. You give up some freedom, but then you get like this sense of security.
In a way, yeah. I think it brings up some really interesting questions. Like, does this strict law enforcement always equal a better society?
Right.
Are there downsides to having this kind of rigid control?
That's a great point. It's not just the laws themselves, but it's also about like the values.
Exactly.
What they're prioritizing. Okay, so let's shift gears geographically. Head over to another country with strict laws,
Okay.
but for very different reasons. Saudi Arabia. So we know they've been making some efforts to open up to the world lately.
But internally, still super strict social and religious laws, especially for women.
Absolutely. Saudi Arabia operates under Sharia law,
Right.
which is derived from the Islamic teachings.
Right.
And this impacts a lot of things. Women's dress codes, social interactions, even access to certain public spaces.
So while we see these, like, news stories about them hosting international events, loosening restrictions on entertainment,
Yeah.
women still face some really significant limitations on their freedoms.
Yes. And it's important to remember there are different interpretations even within Saudi Arabia of Sharia law.
Yeah.
So you have some advocating for a more conservative application.
Yeah.
And then others are pushing for reforms.
Wow. So it's not so simple.
It's complex, very much evolving.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. Those internal debates, right. It reminds us that these aren't like monolithic societies.
Like exactly.
There's all these different viewpoints.
All the time.
And perspectives at play. Okay, well, speaking of differing viewpoints, let's move to a country that's often in the news for its strict political control. China.
Right. China's a fascinating one. A global economic powerhouse.
Huge.
But maintains this tight control
Yeah.
over information and political dissent.
Really tight. Yeah.
Anything that is perceived as anti-government can be very swiftly silenced, and the internet is heavily, heavily censored.
Wait, so even with all the economic growth and the global influence, they still restrict freedom of speech in the press.
They
I mean,
do.
what impact does that have on people?
It raises a lot of questions about, the relationship between economic progress and political freedom.
For sure.
For example, things like the Tiananmen Square protests, that's totally off limits in Chinese media and online.
Wow.
So that censorship, it shapes what information people have access to.
Right.
And it really influences how they understand their own history and the world around them.
That's a powerful example. Control of information shaping perceptions like that. It really makes you think about, like, the information we have access to and how it shapes our own worldview.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's move from information control to, well, control of pretty much everything.
Okay.
North Korea, often considered one of the most isolated authoritarian countries in the world.
Yeah, North Korea is like the prime example of a totalitarian state. The ruling elite, led by Kim Jong-un, they control everything. Every aspect of life. Clothes people wear, information they consume, tourists who visit, constantly monitored.
No way.
Government minders, making sure they don't break rules, don't see anything they shouldn't.
I've even heard that, like, hairstyles are regulated. It's like stepping back in time where individuality is just completely suppressed.
Right.
But why? What's the point of that kind of control?
It's about power, maintaining the power of the ruling party, ensuring obedience.
Right.
But this level of control obviously comes at a massive cost to individual freedoms.
Right, yeah.
Human rights. Free speech is basically non-existent. Internet access, very restricted. So people's ability to learn about the outside world, very limited.
It's hard to imagine living somewhere where you're constantly being watched. And even expressing your thoughts can be dangerous. Speaking of places where expressing your thoughts can be risky, let's talk about Syria.
Yeah. The conflict in Syria has led to these extreme measures to control information, suppress dissent.
Right.
You've got nationwide communication blackouts, restricted internet access, and really serious consequences for journalists who speak out against the government.
So in a country that's already devastated by war, they're limiting access to information and communication even more.
It's a very complex situation. Unfortunately, the pursuit of truth and freedom of the press comes at a high cost in Syria. A lot of Syrian journalists face imprisonment, torture, even death.
It's a chilling reminder of the dangers journalists face around the world and how important it is to protect a free press.
It also makes you wonder, in an environment like that, how do people even know what's really going on? That's the question. When information is controlled so tightly, it's very difficult for people to form their own opinions.
Yeah.
Hold their leaders accountable. It creates a breeding ground for misinformation, propaganda. It makes it so much harder to find peaceful solutions.
It really highlights the power of information, doesn't it? And critical thinking, especially in situations where you're only getting one side of the story. All right, let's shift gears. Head to a country known for its, vibrant culture, laid-back atmosphere, Cuba. But under that sunny exterior, there's a complex reality.
Yeah, Cuba is a communist nation. History of strict laws, government control. It's been opening up to tourism more recently.
Right.
But criticizing the government can still get you in trouble. The internet is heavily monitored. Even certain types of music, like reggaeton.
Really?
Yeah, frowned upon, sometimes banned.
So even though Cuba's known for music and dance, there are limits on what people can listen to, express themselves through art. That seems kind of contradictory.
It is. It's a really interesting mix. On the one hand, they want to attract tourists, project this image of openness.
Right.
But at the same time, it's still a communist state, wary of dissent and outside influences.
So it's like they're trying to balance their ideology with the realities of, a globalized world.
Yeah, it's tough balance.
But how do Cubans themselves navigate these contradictions? Do they feel limited in their ability to express themselves?
That's a great question, and it's one we could spend hours discussing. It's important to remember that within Cuba, there's a whole spectrum of opinions and experiences. Some people embrace the control. Others may want more freedom of expression.
It's easy to make generalizations about a country.
Right.
But it's those individual experiences that really matter.
Absolutely. And speaking of those individual experiences, let's go to a country where those freedoms are shaped by a really complex web of social norms, unwritten rules.
Okay.
Japan.
Japan. So we think politeness, technological advancements, amazing pop culture. But I've also heard that it's a very hierarchical society.
It is.
Lots of unspoken rules.
Yes.
How does that actually play out in everyday life?
Well, Japan's social hierarchy has very deep roots in its history and culture. It influences how people interact at work, in social settings. Big emphasis on respecting your elders. Conforming to group norms, avoiding anything that might cause shame or disrupt that social harmony.
So even if there aren't laws against something, there's that social pressure to conform.
Absolutely. And this can be really challenging for anyone who doesn't fit those traditional roles, or people from different backgrounds.
Wow.
Imagine, for example, being a young person who wants to express their individuality through fashion or music. Nothing illegal about it. But they might face disapproval from their peers.
It's a reminder that social pressure can be just as powerful as any law.
It really can. Speaking of social pressure, let's move to a country where conformity is not just encouraged, it's practically enforced. Equatorial Guinea.
Equatorial Guinea, all right.
So this small Central African nation, maybe not on everyone's radar, but how they control information, definitely worth talking about.
I'm intrigued. What's so unique about it?
Imagine this. Living in a place where bookstores are banned, and learning to read is actually discouraged.
Wait, what? They discourage reading?
That's the reality in Equatorial Guinea. It's a dictatorship.
Yeah.
Ruled by President Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo. He's been in power since 1979.
Wow.
Yeah.
They discourage reading, but why?
Control. It's all about control. By limiting access to information, the government can control the narrative, prevent dissent.
Makes sense.
President Obiang has an iron grip on the media, restricts any filming that might portray the country in a negative light.
So they're keeping their citizens in a bubble, shielded from outside information, influences that might challenge things.
Essentially, yes.
What's the long-term impact of that kind of isolation, though?
That's the big question, isn't it? When you limit access to education, information, you stifle critical thinking, creativity, innovation. You create a society where people are afraid to question, afraid to think for themselves.
It shows how important access to information is, not just for individual growth, but for the health of the whole society.
Absolutely. It's a reminder for us all to be critical. Think about the information we're getting, seek out different perspectives, never stop questioning.
Well said. It sounds like we've already uncovered some pretty fascinating stuff.
We have.
About how these laws, these social norms, shape societies around the world.
Yeah.
But we've got a few more countries to explore, each one with its own unique story to tell. So let's take a quick break, and then we'll continue our deep dive into the world of strict laws.
Sounds good. I'm ready to hear about the rest.
Yeah, me too.
I think it's so interesting, seeing how different cultures approach this whole idea of social control.
Right.
Like, what things do they prioritize? Is it order, security, preserving their culture?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like we're getting a glimpse into what makes these societies tick. Speaking of unique cultural contexts, let's talk about Iran. It's a country that we hear about a lot in the news, often because of its strict social and religious laws.
Yeah, Iran's legal system is really deeply rooted in Sharia law, and that influences, pretty much everything, from how people dress to even just their social interactions.
Right.
So, for instance, men's hairstyles, they have to conform to certain Islamic traditions.
Wow.
And women are required to wear the hijab in public. But it's important to remember that even within Iran, there are different interpretations of Sharia law.
Wow, interesting.
And there are actually a lot of ongoing debates about how it should be applied.
So even in a country that follows a specific religious code, there's still room for different viewpoints.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that these aren't uniform societies where everyone thinks the same way. There's always that diversity of thought, different people interpreting things in their own way. For example, some Iranian women might choose to wear the hijab as a personal expression of their faith.
Yeah.
But others might feel more pressure to wear it just because of social expectations.
That makes sense. It makes you think about how people make those personal choices within such a strict system.
Right. It's like a constant push and pull between expressing yourself and meeting those societal expectations. But what about things that are taboo in Western cultures, like alcohol or certain types of music?
Yeah, I was wondering about that. How does Iran approach those things?
Pretty strict. They see alcohol and some forms of entertainment as being incompatible with Islamic values.
Okay.
So alcohol consumption is completely forbidden, and you won't find any nightclubs blasting, Western pop music or anything like that. This isn't just about personal preference. It's about aligning social behavior with religious principles.
It's a very different way of looking at things compared to the West, where we tend to place a lot of emphasis on individual expression.
Exactly.
So how does Iran balance its own cultural and religious values with, the influence of globalization? Because the world is becoming increasingly interconnected.
It's a challenge, for sure. They have a very rich cultural heritage and a strong national identity, but they've also faced a lot of sanctions and international pressure.
Right.
And that's impacted their economy and their access to global markets.
Of course.
So it's a constant balancing act. How do you preserve your cultural identity while engaging with a globalized world?
It's a tension that a lot of countries are dealing with.
Definitely.
All right, so let's switch gears again and go to a country that's often described as the last truly communist nation, North Korea.
North Korea is a fascinating case, maybe even a little scary. It's a country that has intentionally isolated itself from the rest of the world, and its citizens live under constant surveillance. I mean, they have limited access to information. They can barely contact anyone outside the country.
Wow.
Even something as basic as traveling within North Korea requires special permission.
It sounds like this huge social experiment, but with real people living through it.
It is, and their lives are at stake. You hear these stories about, the 3 generations of punishment rule, right?
Oh, yeah.
Where if one person commits a crime, their whole family is punished, even grandkids.
Is that really true?
It's hard to say for sure how often it's enforced, but the fact that it exists at all really shows how much control the regime has.
That's terrifying.
It's all about creating this atmosphere of fear and repression.
Wow. It's a scary reminder that the choices made by those in power have a huge impact on everyday people.
Absolutely. And it makes you appreciate the freedoms that we have. It's not just some abstract idea. It directly affects people's lives, their opportunities, their ability to be happy.
Yep. That's a really good point. It makes you think. Okay, let's move on to another country where individual freedoms are often sacrificed, this time in the name of national security, Eritrea.
Ah, yes, Eritrea. This is a small African nation. It's been ruled by President Isaias Afwerki since 1993.
Okay.
And his regime, not great. Lots of accusations of human rights abuses.
I don't know much about Eritrea, to be honest. What's going on there?
It's been called the North Korea of Africa because of its repressive policies. They're very isolationist. All news and media are totally controlled by the government. And get this, they even regulate religion.
What? How do they regulate religion?
Public worship is only allowed if you belong to a specific religious sect.
Wow. So you can't even choose your own religion?
Not really. It's seen as a fundamental threat to national unity and stability.
It's a common theme, isn't it? Suppressing dissent, limiting freedom, all in the name of security.
It is. But does that actually work?
That's the big question. Does it create real stability or just resentment that could explode later on?
It's a debate that goes on and on. Political scientists, historians, they're all trying to figure it out.
It's complicated for sure, but it's something to keep in mind as we continue to look at these countries. Okay, let's go back to a country we touched on earlier, Cuba. They're trying to balance economic openness with political control, which is a tricky thing to do.
Yeah, Cuba is a very interesting case. They have this socialist ideology, a vibrant culture, but also a long history of authoritarian rule.
Right.
They've been opening up their economy a little bit, trying to attract foreign investment. But if you criticize the government, you can still get into trouble.
Oh, wow.
And the internet is still very tightly controlled.
So they're trying to reap the benefits of a globalized economy while also keeping a tight grip on power.
Exactly.
But what do Cubans think about that? Do they see it as a fair trade-off?
It's hard to say. There are so many different opinions within Cuba, and those are all shaped by people's individual experiences.
Of course.
What information they have access to, what they hope for the future. Some people might be happy with the stability and social safety net that the government provides.
Yeah.
While others might want more freedom of expression, more economic opportunities.
It just shows that even in a country with strict laws, you can't make assumptions about how everyone feels.
You can't. Every person has their own story. Okay, so let's head over to a country that's famous for its order, its efficiency, and yeah, its strict laws. Singapore.
Ah, Singapore. It's often seen as a model of success, right?
It is. Economically successful, very socially ordered.
And a lot of that is credited to their strict laws.
Right. They have laws against littering, chewing gum, vandalism.
Right.
All those things that can make a city feel dirty or unsafe.
Right. And it's worked. It's a very clean, safe, prosperous place.
It is, but it comes at a cost. Their freedom of speech and assembly is limited, there's strict control over the media, and the punishments for even small offenses are harsh.
So it's that classic trade-off again.
Yeah.
A well-functioning society, but less individual freedom.
Exactly. And it's a trade-off that Singaporeans themselves are constantly grappling with. Some people think it's necessary for the greater good.
Okay.
But others wish they had more space to express themselves, to disagree with the government.
That's interesting. It makes you think, is there ever a perfect balance between order and freedom?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Philosophers have been trying to answer that for centuries.
It's a debate that's important for all of us, especially as the world becomes more and more interconnected.
I think what's most important is that we keep having that conversation.
Absolutely. We need to listen to different perspectives, challenge our assumptions, and try to create a world where individual freedoms are respected, even as we acknowledge the need for social order and the fact that different cultures have different values.
I completely agree. And speaking of challenging assumptions, let's go to a country that often defies easy labels. Japan.
Japan is fascinating, so technologically advanced, such a unique culture. And it's this interesting mix of ancient traditions and modern ideas.
It is. But beneath that, there's this whole web of social norms and unspoken rules.
Right.
And those can be just as powerful as any law.
I've heard that. So in Japan, one of the most striking things is their emphasis on conformity and social harmony.
Oh, yeah. There's this pressure to fit in, to not offend anyone, to make sure you don't damage your group's reputation.
Wow.
And it shows up in these really subtle ways, like the complicated rules of bowing, how seniority is super important in the workplace.
So even if there aren't laws about those things, you still feel that pressure to conform.
You really do. And it can be a good thing and a bad thing. On the one hand, it helps explain why Japan has such low crime rates. There's a sense of collective responsibility, and their social systems are very efficient.
That makes sense.
But on the other hand, it can make it hard for people to be truly individualistic, to be creative, or to speak out against things they don't agree with.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly. And I think it raises a lot of questions about how Japanese people themselves feel about these expectations.
Right. Do they ever feel stifled? Or do they just see these norms as part of their cultural identity?
It's something we should explore further.
Okay, well, that sounds like a great place to pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
I think this deep dive's been really eye-opening, seeing all these different ways that societies try to find that balance between freedom and control.
It has been. We've gone from Singapore's emphasis on order to China controlling information so tightly, to North Korea, which is almost like a textbook totalitarian state.
It's amazing how much what we consider normal is shaped by where we grow up, right?
It's true. We don't even realize how many freedoms we have until we see how things are done in other places. And before the break, we were talking about Japan with its fascinating social norms.
Right. Japan's a great example of how powerful these unwritten rules and social pressures can be, just as strong as any law. We were talking about how conformity and group harmony are so important there.
Yeah, it affects everything from how people behave to how they work together. I'm curious, though, how does this actually play out for individuals? Do Japanese people ever feel trapped by these expectations?
It's tough to say. It's not a simple yes or no answer. There are so many different opinions and experiences. Some people might find those norms comforting. It gives them a sense of belonging. But others might feel restricted, like they can't be themselves.
I can see how younger generations might be pushing back a bit, especially with all the global influences they're exposed to.
You're absolutely right. There's definitely a generational difference in how people view these traditional expectations. Younger people are more likely to challenge them, to want to express themselves more individually. It's not just rebellion, though. It's more about trying to find a way to respect their culture while also figuring out who they are as individuals.
And it's a tough balance, holding on to the past while adapting to a world that's changing so quickly. What happens, though, if someone in Japan breaks those unwritten rules? Like, what are the consequences?
Social disapproval can be a huge deal in Japan. Someone who goes against those norms might be ostracized. People might gossip about them or even publicly shame them.
Wow.
And that fear of rejection, it can be a really powerful motivator for conformity, even if there are no legal punishments.
It's a reminder that control doesn't always come from laws. Sometimes it's built into the culture, the expectations we have for each other.
Exactly. And it shows us that freedom isn't just about the absence of rules. It's also about having the space to be yourself, to say what you think, and to live by your own values, even if those values are different from everyone else's.
That's a great way to put it. It makes you realize that freedom is so multifaceted, and it can be experienced in so many different ways depending on your culture. It's not just about voting or speaking your mind. It's about feeling like you have control over your own life, that you can make your own choices.
It's about being able to choose your own path, even if it's different from what's considered normal or acceptable. And it's about being brave enough to challenge those norms when they feel wrong.
It's been amazing to explore all these perspectives on freedom and control with you. I think it's given us a lot to think about.
I agree. It reminds us that the world is full of different ways of being, and there's no single right answer to these questions. The key is to keep asking questions, to be open to new ideas, and to work towards a world where everyone's individual freedoms are respected, even as we acknowledge the need for order and the fact that cultures are different.
I love that. Keep asking questions, be open to new ideas. That's what the deep dive is all about. So, to wrap things up, I have a little challenge for everyone listening.
Okay, I like this.
Think about the laws and social norms in your own life. Which ones would seem strange or restrictive to someone from a totally different background? And which ones do you actually value the most?
That's a great challenge. Makes you step outside your own bubble and see the world through someone else's eyes.
Exactly. That's what learning is all about. So keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.